Hi and welcome to Tristan Channel, and today I'll be talking about one of the most dangerous materials in use, asbestos. Now, the reason why I want to address this important issue is because in May 2022 my dad died of what first was diagnosed to be just cancer, but the coroner's report, when processed etc., came back indicating that his death was unnatural and caused by asbestos exposure. If you know anyone who has worked with this substance or in the building trade, especially before the time it was banned, it may be worth getting a medical examination as soon as possible. Now, asbestos is a naturally occurring fibrous silicate mineral. There are 6 types, all of which composed of long and thin fibrous crystals, each fibre being composed of many microscopic fibrillars that can be released into the atmosphere by abrasion and other processes. Inhalation of asbestos fibres can lead to various dangerous lung conditions, including mesothelioma, asbestosis, and lung cancer. So it is now notorious as a serious health and safety hazard. Archaeological studies have found evidence of asbestos being used as far back as the Stone Age to strengthen ceramic pots, but large-scale mining began at the end of the 19th century when manufacturers and builders began using asbestos for its desirable physical properties. Asbestos is an excellent electrical insulator and is highly fire resistant, so for much of the 20th century it was very commonly used across the world as a building material. Until its adverse effects on human health were more widely acknowledged in the 1970s. Many buildings constructed before the 1980s are thought to contain asbestos. The use of asbestos for construction and fireproofing has been made illegal in many countries. Despite this, at least 100,000 people are thought to have died each year from disease related to asbestos exposure. In part, this is because many older buildings still contain asbestos. In addition, the consequences of exposure can take decades to arise. The most common diseases associated with chronic asbestos exposure are asbestosis, scarring of the lungs due to asbestos inhalation, and mesothelioma, a type of cancer. Many developing countries still support the use of asbestos as a building material, and mining of asbestos is ongoing, with top producer Russia having an estimated production of 790,000 tons in 2020. Asbestos use dates back at least 4,500 years, but in modern day, the large-scale asbestos industry began in the mid-19th century. Early attempts at producing asbestos paper and cloth in Italy began in the 1850s, but were unsuccessful in creating a market for such products. Thank goodness. Canadian samples of asbestos were displayed in London in 1862, and the first companies were formed in England and Scotland to exploit this resource. Asbestos was first used in the manufacture of yarn, and German industrialist Louis Wertheim adopted this process in his factories in Germany. In 1871, the Patent Asbestos Manufacturing Company was established in Glasgow, and during the following decades, the Clydebank area became a centre for the nascent industry. Sorry, that's all getting all cloggy. Industrial scale mining began in the Thetford Hills, Quebec from the 1870s. Sir William Edmund Logan was the first to notice the large deposits of Chrysotile in the hills in his capacity as head of the Geological Survey of Canada. Samples of the minerals from there were displayed in London and elicited much interest. With the opening of Quebec Central Railway in 1876, mining entrepreneurs such as Andrew Stuart Johnson established the asbestos industry in the province. The 50-ton output of the mines in 1878 rose to over 10,000 tons in the 1890s, with the adoption of machine technologies and expanded production. For a long time, the world's largest asbestos mine was the Jeffrey mine in the town of Asbestos, Quebec. Asbestos production began in the Urals of the Russian Empire in the 1880s and the Alpine regions of northern Italy, with the formation in Turin of the Italo-English Pure Asbestos Company in 1876, although this was soon swamped by the greater production levels from the Canadian mines. Mining also took off in South Africa from 1893 under the aegis of the British businessman Francis Oates, the director of De Beers Company. It was in South Africa that production of amosite began in 1910. The US asbestos industry had an early start in 1858 when fibrous amphilite was mined for use as asbestos insulation by the John Company, a predecessor to the current Johns Manville, at a quarry at Ward's Hill on Staten Island, New York. US production began in earnest in 1899 with the discovery of the large deposits in Belvedere Mountain. The use of asbestos became increasingly widespread towards the end of the 19th century, when its diverse applications included fire-retardant coatings, concrete, bricks, pipes, and fireplace cement, heat, fire, and acid-resistant gaskets, pipe insulation, ceiling insulation, fireproof drywall, flooring, roofing, lawn furniture, and drywall joint compounds. In 2011, it was reported that over 50% of the UK houses still contain asbestos, despite a ban on asbestos products some years earlier. In Japan, particularly after World War II, it's like the cladding, isn't it? Asbestos was used in the manufacture of ammonium sulfate for purposes of rice production, sprayed upon the ceilings, iron skeletons, and the walls of railway cars and buildings during the 1960s, and used for energy efficiency reasons as well. Production of asbestos peaked in Japan peaked in 1974, went through ups and downs until about 1990, when production began to drop dramatically. In 1899, H. Montague Murray noted the negative health effects of asbestos. The first documented death related to asbestos was in 1906. In the early 1900s, researchers began to notice a larger number of early deaths and lung problems in asbestos mining towns. The first such study was conducted by Murray at the Charing Cross Hospital, London, in 1900, in which a post-mortem investigation discovered asbestos traces in the lungs of a young man who had died from pulmonary fibrosis after having worked for 14 years in an asbestos textile factory. It's like my dad had traces on his lungs. Adelaide Anderson, the inspector of the factories in Britain, included asbestos in a list of harmful industrial substances in 1902. Similar investigations were conducted in France in 1906 and Italy in 1908. The first diagnosis of asbestos was made in the UK in 1924. Nellie Kershaw was employed at Turner Brothers Asbestos in Rochdale, Greater Manchester, England, from 1917, spinning raw asbestos fibre into yarn. Her death in 1924 led to a formal inquest. Pathologist William Edmund Cook testified that his examination of the lungs indicated old scarring indicative of a previous healed tuberculosis infection and extensive fibrosis, in which were visible particles of mineral matter of various shapes, but the large majority have sharp angles. Having compared these particles with samples of asbestos dust provided by S.A. Henry, His Majesty's Medical Inspector of Factories, Cook concluded that they originated from asbestos and were beyond a reasonable doubt the primary cause of the fibrosis of the lungs and therefore of death. As a result of Cook's paper, Parliament commissioned an inquiry into the effects of asbestos dust by E.R.A. Merriweather, Medical Inspector of Factories, and C.W. Price, a Factory Inspector and pioneer of dust monitoring and control. Their subsequent report, Occurrence of Pulmonary Fibrosis and Other Pulmonary Affections in Asbestos Workers, was presented to Parliament on 24th of March 1930. It concluded that the development of asbestos was irrefutably linked to the prolonged inhalation of asbestos dust and included the first health study of asbestos workers, which found that 66% of those employed for 20 years or more suffered from asbestosis. The report led to the publication of the first asbestos industry regulations in 1931, which came into effect on 1st of March 1932. These rules regulated ventilation and made asbestosis an excusable work-related disease. The term mesothelioma, sorry if I butchered that, was first used in medical literature in 1931. Its association with asbestos was first noted sometime in 1940s. Similar legislation followed in the United States about 10 years later. Approximately 100,000 people in the United States have died or are terminally ill from asbestos exposure related to shipbuilding in the Hampton Roads area, a shipbuilding centre. Mesothelioma occurrence is 7 times the national rate. Thousands of tons of asbestos were used in World War II ships to insulate piping, boilers, steam engines and steam turbines. There were approximately 4.3 million shipyard workers in the United States during the war. For every 1,000 workers, about 14 died of mesothelioma and an unknown number died of asbestosis. The United States government and the asbestos industry have been criticised for not acting quickly enough to inform the public of dangers and to reduce public exposure in the late 1970s. Court documents proved that asbestos industry officials knew of asbestos dangers since the 1930s and have concealed them from the public. In Australia, asbestos was widely used in construction and other industries between 1946 and 1980. From the 1970s, there was an increasing concern about the dangers of asbestos, and it was phased out, with mining having ceased in 1983. The use of asbestos was phased out in 1989 and banned entirely in December 2003. The dangers of asbestos are now well known in Australia, and there's help and support for those suffering from asbestosis or mesothelioma. The most common diseases associated with chronic asbestos exposure are asbestosis, scarring of the lungs due to asbestos inhalation, and mesothelioma, cancer associated with asbestos. Mesothelioma is an aggressive form of cancer and often leads to a life expectancy of less than 12 months after diagnosis. All types of asbestos fibres are known to cause serious health hazards in humans and animals. Asbestos and crocodilite are considered the most hazardous asbestos fibre types. However, chrysotile asbestos has also produced tumours in animals and is a recognised cause of asbestosis and malignant cancer in humans, and cancer has been observed in people who were occupationally exposed to chrysotile, family members of the occupationally exposed, and residents who lived close to asbestos factories and mines. During the 1980s and again in the 1990s, the asbestos industry suggested at times that the process of making asbestos cement could neutralise the asbestos either via chemical process or by causing the cement to attach to the fibres and changing their physical size. Subsequent studies showed that this was untrue, and that decades-old asbestos cement, when broken, releases asbestos fibres identical to those found in nature with no detectable alteration. Exposure to asbestos in the forms of fibres is always considered dangerous. Working with or exposure to material that is fireable, or materials or works that could cause the release of loose asbestos fibres, is considered high risk. Bloody hay fever. In general, people who become ill from inhaling asbestos, having been regularly exposed in a job where they work directly with the material. The US Occupational Safety and Health Administration has standards to protect workers from the hazards of exposure to asbestos in the workplace. The permissible exposure limit for asbestos is 0.1 fibre per cubic centimetre of air as an 8-hour time weight average, crazy, with an excursion limit of 1.0 asbestos fibres per cubic centimetre over a 30-metre period. Worldwide, 66 countries and territories, including those in the EU, have banned the use of asbestos. Exemption for minor uses are permitted in some countries listed on the internet. However, all countries listed must have banned the use of all types of asbestos. Where I live in the United Kingdom, blue and brown asbestos materials were banned outright. In 1985, while the import, sale and second-hand reuse of white asbestos was outlawed in 1999. The 2012 Control of Asbestos Regulations, updating and replacing the previous 2006 law, state that owners of a non-domestic buildings, e.g. factories and offices, have a duty to manage asbestos on the premises by making themselves aware of its presence and ensuring the material does not deteriorate, removing it if necessary. Employers, example construction companies, whose operatives may come into contact with asbestos, must also provide annual asbestos training to their workers. So it may still be present in some buildings, so information on said buildings are important. I personally think it should be all removed it's having a little bit is not even worth the risk. Sadly, the United States remains one of the few developed countries to not completely ban asbestos. To add, the fibres may remain dormant in the body for many years. It is thought that it usually takes between 30 to 40 years from when asbestos exposure took place for any symptoms to come to light, although it can take more or less than 30 to 40 years in some cases. Asbestos fibres can cause genetic mutations to cells in the body that leads to the growth of cancer. Mesothelioma is associated with occupational asbestos exposure and traditionally affects people who have worked in heavy industries such as shipbuilding, power stations, and the construction industry. These are examples of cases that we have dealt with, that have been dealt with over the years from people from a diverse range of occupations and backgrounds. However, mesothelioma can also be caused by very low levels of asbestos. That's why it's not worth the risk. It's crazy they knew it was dangerous since the early 1900s, yet allowed companies to use it. Even in its removal, specialists are involved with protective equipment. So, because of what's transpired with my dad, I wanted to do a video to illustrate how important this matter is. And if you have worked with it or have jobs that involved its use, or even family members, it's worth getting a medical as soon as possible. However, as stated by the NHS website, there is no cure for asbestos once it has developed, exposed. It's not possible to reverse the damage to the lungs, but they may be able to help you with things that may not aggravate it and prolong your life, etc. But anyway, thank you for watching. Until next video, take care and be well.